When we think of the Beatles' music, we usually think of one specific trademark, Lennon-McCartney. It's the most famous songwriting partnership of the 20th century, and those two names define almost their entire catalog. But if we rewind past the global fame and the first number one hits, we find a rare exception. Back in 1961, there was a unique track credited to an unexpected duo, Lennon and Harrison. The song is Cry for a Shadow, an obscure instrumental track. Its story begins not in Abbey Road, but in Hamburg, West Germany, in June 1961. The Beatles were playing brutal sets at the Top 10 Club, putting in the hours and getting tight as a working band.
We've been to Hamburg, I think that's where we found our style. We developed our style because of this fellow there, he used to say, hey, you've got to make a show for the people. And he used to come up every night shouting, Max Show. So we used to Max Show, and John used to dance around like a gorilla, and we'd all, knock our heads together and things like that.
And we were just developing our chemistry. We put in a lot of work. We literally worked 8 hours a day. It was a full factory day.
This was their second trip to the city. The first run the previous year had been a trial by fire.
We didn't really have that much money. We only just really had enough to feed ourselves. So there was nothing really to show for it.
They were living in this, just a pit. It was just a hole in the bleeding wall. I mean, they were just sleeping in there pretending it was fine. But they were playing, so it was fine.
Everything else was such a buzz, being right in the middle of the naughtiest city in the world. At 17 years old, it was kind of exciting.
For 3 months, they slept in the cold, windowless back rooms of the Bambi Kino cinema and endured endless hours on stage, fueled by alcohol and pills.
In Hamburg, because we had to work 6 or 7 hours a night on stage with no rest, the waiters always had these pills called Preludin. And so the waiters, when they'd see the musicians falling over with tiredness or with drink, they'd give you the pill. You could work almost endlessly until the pill wore off, then you'd have to have another.
The 1960 German run ended in disaster. First, authorities discovered George was underage and deported him. Days later, Paul and Pete were arrested on suspicion of setting fire to their freezing cinema quarters and were thrown in a Hamburg jail before they too were deported. Stranded and broke, John eventually returned to England alone. Scattered back in Liverpool, the defeated band didn't speak for weeks, convinced the dream was already over. But the brutal apprenticeship paid off. Returning in the spring of 1961, they had graduated from the rough stages of the Indra and Kaiserkeller. They were now polished professionals, and they caught the attention of an important German record producer.
So the second time we went back, when I was 18, that's when we were backing up Tony Sheridan. And at that point, this fella came into the club they said, oh, he's this famous record producer and musician. He was called Bert Kaempfert. And his claim to fame was he had a #1 hit in America. But he came in the club, and remember, this buzz went around, we've got to be good, play really good, we may get a chance to record.
They were hired not as the main act, but as a backing band for British singer Tony Sheridan. For these sessions, they were temporarily renamed the Beat Brothers. It was the band's first recording contract ever.
And we got all pleased with ourselves, and then we got to the studio, and he just wanted us to, back up Sheridan. I remember feeling a little depressed, but we did nevertheless get to do that, My Bonnie.
On the morning of June 22nd, they were taken to Friedrich-Ebert-Halle, a gymnasium inside a school. They recorded right on the stage, curtains drawn to dampen the echo. The lineup had George on lead guitar, John on rhythm guitar, and Pete Best on drums. Paul took over the role of bassist for the group. Stuart Sutcliffe, the band's bass player at the time, did not participate in the recording, as he was already distancing himself from the group's musical activities.
Well, when we first met him, he couldn't play at all. And he learned a few tunes. Occasionally, it was a bit embarrassing. He didn't, if he had a lot of changes to it, he was But he knew that too. That's why, he was never really that at ease being in the band.
The Beatles backed Tony Sheridan on 5 numbers, including a rock version of My Bonnie featuring George on lead guitar. Kaempfert also gave the boys 2 tracks to themselves. One was a cover of Ain't She Sweet by John Lennon.
Oh, ain't she sweet? We'll see you walking down.
Then there was an original guitar instrumental composed by John and George. Lacking a title, the band called it Beatle Bop. Eventually, they settled on Cry for a Shadow, a playful jab at Cliff Richard's famous backing band. George explained the origin of the song in a 1987 interview. "We always used to have a little joke on the Shadows. It was a time when everybody had matching ties and handkerchiefs and suits, and they all did these funny walks while they were playing." They signed a contract entirely in German, so they had no idea what they were actually signing.
We thought Polydor, the biggest label, and it could have been the biggest label in the world for all we called, and it was just like common sense went out the window, to be quite honest. It was very much a case of, where do we sign? Where do we sign? What are we signing for? Etc., etc.
It stipulated that they would be credited anonymously as the Beat Brothers, and it locked them out of ongoing royalties in exchange for a flat session fee.
And it was only afterwards when we recorded, we realised that we were getting paid a session fee, and, we'd had the bums rush. That was it. But it was just a fantastic feeling to know they had a record contract, because nothing like that had happened to a band in Liverpool.
How did John and George end up writing a song together at this early stage, completely bypassing Paul McCartney? An answer may be found the year before on the Beatles' first trip to Hamburg, specifically on the living arrangements and the bitter internal friction they caused. When the Beatles were assigned to sleep in the infamous storage rooms behind the Bambi Kino cinema, John immediately claimed the best bed in the main room. He was quickly joined by Stuart Sutcliffe and George. Paul, meanwhile, was pushed into a tiny, unlit second room alongside the band's quiet new drummer, Pete Best. As Beatles historian Mark Lewisohn notes in his book, this was a triple blow for Paul. He was in a dump, stuck with a roommate he barely knew, and suffering the wretched feeling of being left out of the inner circle. His constant complaining about the room strained his relationship with the rest of the band. Paul was also becoming increasingly jealous of John's close friendship with Stuart Sutcliffe and impatient with his musical limitations. This caused continuous episodes of tension between them.
Stuart and I got a little bit fraught too. See, because I claim that what I was trying to do was make sure we were musically very good. But this did create a couple of rifts, and I can see now how I could have been more sensitive to it.
The animosity became so thick that Stuart wrote a letter to a friend in Liverpool stating, "Paul has turned out the real black sheep of the trip. Everyone hates him, and I only feel sorry for him." This friction caused a complete halt to the Lennon-McCartney partnership. Despite having months of closeted opportunity in Hamburg, they wrote absolutely no songs together during this trip. Their initial songwriting hot streak from 1958 had cooled. John and Paul were destined to be the band's primary creative engine, but in Hamburg, John and George were the ones sharing a room and sharing a connection.
The most important thing to writing a tune with somebody else is to have a mutual trust and also to have a compatible background.
It was within this dynamic that the song was born. Fellow Liverpool musician Rory Storm wanted the Beatles to learn the Shadows' instrumental Man of Mystery. He tried to whistle the first few bars, but forgot how the rest of it went. John and George picked up their guitars and started a jam, working out how the song might have gone. By the end of the session, they had created their own twangy, Shadows-like pastiche. They would never share a songwriting credit again.
Every Beatle record that was a song of mine, I wrote alone. And occasionally I got a lyric, a line from John when I was stuck. But at the same time, I gave them lyrics too. Like I wrote some lyrics in Eleanor Rigby and Come Together and things like that.
The Beatles left Hamburg expecting an immediate release for their instrumental. Instead, Polydor sat on the recordings. Cry for a Shadow finally surfaced in France in January 1962 on a Tony Sheridan EP titled Mr. Twist. By mid-1963, as Beatlemania took hold, Polydor re-released the EP in Germany. In early 1964, it was released as a single in Britain, Germany, and Australia, while relegated to a B-side in North America. It holds another distinction. It is one of only 2 officially released Beatles singles to feature Pete Best on drums, alongside Ain't She Sweet. Decades later, in 1995, the song took its rightful place on the Anthology 1 compilation. Cry for a Shadow is a snapshot of the band's early years when, for one brief moment, the songwriting team of the Beatles was simply Lennon and Harrison.